So last week I did a video on how to fix the Star Wars franchise. Okay, I covered what the problems were with Star Wars, how I would go about fixing it if I was ever in charge of Star Wars, and not only did it do really well, I had a really fun time making the video and also engaging in everyone's comments on what they would do, and I thought that it was very constructive, but also fun, and I wanted to do that again this week, but with Marvel. Okay, another fandom that I was really into for a long time, but has kind of lost me. I will say Marvel hasn't lost me as much as Star Wars has, in terms of like just what I'm aware is going on in the scheme. Like obviously Doomsday is something I'm very aware of. I've made videos about it in the past. Doomsday, as I've mentioned, is very important for Disney. However that performs, how people react to it is all going to affect the future of the MCU after the fact. But I wanted to give my opinions of what I would do for the MCU. Okay, rules here. I'm going to structure this in the exact same way I did the last video, so it's going to be in 3 parts with a prologue that's essentially just stuff that we would have to cover base-wise if I was in charge of Marvel, again, which I'm never going to be. Let's start with what went wrong. Okay, there was too many characters and shows. Okay, you have to understand, after the Endgame, Marvel was on such a high reputation-wise. They had built up to something and paid it off, which is something that very rarely happens, especially in modern day time, to have something built up from the beginning and built to it. It was just phenomenal to see. People loved it. And personally, I would have taken a longer break. I would have taken like a decade break. And I actually said that on the channel before, and people were like, well, of course they're not going to do that because they're not going to make money. But I point to the previous 3 films that they've made not making very much money at the box office to say that, yeah, I think that a decade could have really worked. Again, build up a saga. We can't undo phases 4, 5, and 6. I'm not even sure which phase we're on right now, but there's too many characters and shows. People simply can't keep up with every single show. I think there was like 3 shows a year, 3 movies. Like that's just a lot, especially when a lot of your stuff, not only number 1, isn't going anywhere, which is another problem we're going to be talking about in a little bit, but also just isn't good. You know, you have to do one of those 3 things. You have to slow down, make it go somewhere, or make it good. And they just weren't doing that for a long time. And Marvel has even admitted to really focusing on quantity over quality. And Kevin Feige has even said that like the studio, because of Disney Plus, really pushed him to make a lot of TV shows, and that really did affect his brand. So there was just too many characters and shows, and like I said, it was not connected. I felt like I was watching so much stuff that was just going nowhere. A lot of seasons of shows where we didn't even see the superhero come into play until the very last little bit, you know, the very last episode or something. Just a lot of frustration, a lot of formulaic things. I think, like I said, with Star Wars, it's a little harder to kind of try to figure out where to go forward because Star Wars has had many different lives. It's had many different versions and iterations. Marvel has a winning formula that, in my opinion, was very specific. And I think that the problem really was that they didn't go forward with it. So I think that it's a little bit easier to take it back to where it was, but also at the same time, I have more notes written down for what I would do with Marvel. So I think that there's a lot of notes and a lot of things I would change, but I think they're very specific and very much leaning forward towards it. But also retconning things. I mean, like, look at what's happening with Doomsday. One of my biggest problems with Doomsday, I'm excited about Doomsday and I really want to be excited about it and I really hope it's good. One of my biggest problems is that I just feel like I said, we finally had something that had a finale to it, right? Like years were spent all leading to Tony Stark dying, to everything that happened with Cap. Story-wise, continuity-wise, yeah, there's some issues with Endgame, but I think character-wise, it went exactly where I wanted it to go. And I'm just really upset that we're just kind of like throwing that out the window. And again, not even because it necessarily feels earned, but because I think it feels like a cash grab. In my opinion, that's my problem. Again, I would love to love Doomsday. We haven't even gotten a trailer, so I could change my mind, but right now I'm just not loving what I'm seeing for those reasons. So like I said, we're keeping Doomsday and Secret Wars. What am I doing after those films? I've been head of MCU. I've taken Kevin Feige's place. This is what I'm doing. Okay, so Prologue. Again, Prologue is just day 1 in the studio. Here's some changes we're going to be making. Okay, stop shooting unfinished scripts. This is something James Gunn has implemented with DC. It actually sounds basic, right? Like you wouldn't actually imagine that we'd be even having this problem in the first place, but it's actually becoming a very big problem in Hollywood. Really, to meet release dates, I'd say stop that. Actually, we're just going to put projects into production when the scripts are done, and then we're going to release them accordingly. And I understand Marvel in particular has a problem with this because their stuff has to be done continuity-wise and in a certain order. But then why don't you just, again, plan it either all out in advance or enter something into the continuity of the world that's already done, already has a good script? I would just stop that. I think that you can clearly tell when you watch the films what's happening. I would do lower budget films. There's no need for some of these TV shows and movies about these like B-list side characters to be like $250 million. Like, what are we doing here? Like, the Thunderbolts should not have flopped, honestly, genuinely. Not only for many reasons, but also it's just so expensive to make for a bunch of side characters. That's also their appeal. You know, I would keep the budgets way down. And like I said, I would really focus on quality. So I would really be director driven. Again, I would have a baseline story. I'd have a skeleton of an overall arc, an overall idea, a saga, as they call them at Marvel. but I would really let the individual projects be controlled through a director. I think that there's a lot of really interesting places you can go with that, and I think that doing that, establishing that as a precedent, would allow a lot of directors to come and want to work with you. You know, Marvel doesn't have a good reputation, kind of started a bad reputation when it came to, like, I think a lot of modern day cinema problems, you know, even if you agree with it or not. I think that's where the conversation really originated, was with Marvel movies. I would put the characters that didn't work in Doomsday and Secret Wars. Okay, so like I'm a big believer personally, and I think, again, damage is already done. I'm not here to try to redo phases 4 and 5 and 6, but that a lot of the characters that we never saw again would have worked if we had tried to push them forward. I think we gave them one movie and gave up, and I think that, you know, you look at phase 1 of the MCU, it was fine. It wasn't amazing. Where MCU really came to be was late phase 2 and phase 3, you know, where we really got to delve into these characters. You know, like Shang-Chi is a great phase 1 movie. I think Eternals is a fine phase 1 movie. I would have loved to see those characters be developed, but we just didn't get to see them be developed. But I'd put all of them in Doomsday and Secret Wars. I plan on probably getting rid of them, again, unless you just had a really cool use for them in the future phases. If the directors come up with really cool ideas, if people come into this space and they want to play with those characters and have like really cool ideas for those, obviously I'd put them on the back burner and I'd let them come into the universe again. But personally, if I'm planning a new phase, I'd put them in Doomsday and Secret Wars, and I would write some way for them to not be in the movies anymore, but also not necessarily be canonically dead. And then I would establish an Avengers team before the finale. Right into it, Avengers is the brand. Marvel is the brand, yes, but Avengers is the brand. We're getting a list, sticky notes, whatever we have to do, and we're establishing an Avengers team. Okay, that takes us to part 1, which would be like phase 1 of the universe, I guess. And we're gonna take a break for a few years, and we're gonna write a saga start to finish. Again, it can be a skeleton of an idea, but it has to be an idea, a solid foundation. Okay, again, I'm not saying you can't play with some of these things. They can be interchangeable, but they'll have to hit the same beats. And like I said, I would take however long it needs to. I think the longer you take a break, the better, personally. So I would say take however long you need to. But if you have a really cool idea for a saga within a year, sure, let's get it started. I think that was, again, a problem with just phase 4 of the MCU. Like, why were we starting with Black Widow? That story didn't really go anywhere. Black Widow had already died in Endgame. I think that it just didn't make a lot of sense for that. Every story will also have an overarching purpose. Again, kind of goes back to the idea of writing a whole saga. Every story will have at least some purpose, even if it's just something small, like an end credit scene. I think, for instance, Guardians of the Galaxy is a really great example of being an individual one-off story that also really fits into the overall saga of the Infinity Stones very, very well. And that's what I would do. Again, I'm not saying we're not going to branch out or have some new ideas, but I would at least have every film have a purpose within this storyline. And I would give the X-Men the Guardians treatment. I wouldn't integrate them with the MCU quite yet. They've always been separate. I think it can be overwhelming, and I think it's going to be a lot to immediately introduce them with the X-Men. I think a lot of times I don't necessarily love when they interact with the Avengers a whole lot. Don't worry, we're going to get there. But I would establish them themselves individually first. I don't know if you want to set them in a different universe. You know, I would just establish them in their own space first. Again, think Guardians of the Galaxy. Very much connected storyline, what was going on with the overall story of the MCU, but they were their own characters in their own universe. And that's what I would do with that. I would do no new characters and only sequels to the characters that already worked. Okay, so that we already know were established. You know, Black Panther 2, Fantastic Four, things like that. I would do sequels to them. But I wouldn't introduce any new characters. Like I said, if someone wants to come in and they're like, hey, I have a great idea for like a Shang-Chi 2, I'd say, hey, that's great, amazing, we'll do it. But we're not establishing any new characters. Even within those films, they're not getting cool sidekicks or whatever. Marvel was doing that for a little bit. Just them in their storyline, okay? And I would only keep the multiverse for the Fantastic Four and the X-Men, okay? I really liked the Fantastic Four movie, and I want to keep them in that universe. And I think that can just be part of the characters. Like, they can just travel the multiverse. And again, X-Men can be in a different universe, but it doesn't have to be confusing, because I wouldn't have them multiverse hopping quite yet into the MCU. I would just have them be in a separate universe and be like, we're gonna get there, again, teasing these things, like explaining it, but also having an answer. I would have Fantastic Four being the only characters that could actually like communicate with the other multiverse, keeping it simple. And then I would start establishing Wanda movies. So we would have Wanda 1 and maybe Wanda 2. Wanda gets her own trilogy. This leads us into part 2. Wanda, Black Panther, and Spider-Man are the main 3. Remember in the Infinity Saga when it was very clearly Thor, Captain America, and Iron Man? That's going to be Wanda, Black Panther, and Spider-Man, okay? We're going to go some really cool places with these characters. They're already beloved, they're already fan favorites, so let's just commit to that and let's make them their own trio. They each get their own trilogy within this saga. I know some of them have already had trilogies, some of them have already had films, but they're each going to get their own trilogy within just this saga alone. We're also going to make the multiverse revolve around Wanda and the No More Mutants storyline. So that's gonna kind of be our civil war of this Infinity Saga, right? It's not necessarily going to be the big bad, it's not going to be the main finale, but it's definitely going to be something that is set up in like an Avengers film and then paid off later in their own film. It's going to split the characters, have them have their own little divide. That's what we're going to establish. Again, that's going to be a civil war of this saga. And then Wanda's going to be the big bad for the second Avengers film. Again, we're going to be making Avengers films throughout this, you know, very similar to Avengers 1 and Age of Ultron. It's not going to be a Doomsday Secret War scenario where we only have Avengers for the huge big grand finales. We're going to establish a team, and that's going to be the second film, was that Wanda versus the rest of the Avengers. Again, very similar to Civil War. And so that leads us to part 3. Okay, the big grand finale. We're merging the Avengers and the X-Men for the big bad. Avengers versus X-Men would be part 1. So that would be our Avengers Doomsday. That'd be Avengers Infinity War, Avengers versus X-Men. Again, its own very centered storyline. We've been establishing it for a long time, not just within the conflicts going on with the Avengers, but also the X-Men. But also what I'm going to do, and I think that this might be a little controversial for comic book people. I love this storyline, so this is why I'm really going to have built to it. But the big finale, the end game of this universe, the Secret Wars of this universe, is going to be the Dark Phoenix saga. So it's going to be Phoenix, Jean Grey versus pretty much everyone in the universe. Yes, I know the Avengers aren't part of that storyline. Like I said, I know that that might be a little bit controversial, but that's what I would do. Again, I think that that's a really cool way to kind of mimic maybe what happened with the Wanda storyline. Maybe Wanda can even be part in taking down Dark Phoenix. I just think that that'd be a really cool storyline. We've also yet to see the Dark Phoenix storyline done in a correct way. We've tried multiple times, but I think really building up to that storyline, really having a cool place to go with it, could be really fun and really interesting. So that's what I would do if I was in charge of the MCU. I think it was really fun because, like I said, in Marvel, you really have references to go off of in specific storylines, whereas Star Wars, a lot of my criticism was just create something new, an original storyline, but this is very specific stuff. So let me know what you think down below. Like I said, one of my favorite parts of the last video was seeing what everybody else would have done. I think that it was just really fun exercise and really fun constructive criticism for this universe. Let me know what you would do down below. Please consider subscribing. It really helps my channel. I'm really trying to grow this channel, so please consider doing that down below. And yeah, peace out.